Welcome to 17th Century Tales, East Midlands Civil War stories recorded from a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. Episode 8, The Rubbish Roundhead. Because this is a National Civil War Centre podcast and the National Civil War Centre is in Newark, and Newark was a hardcore Cavalier town, the stories in these podcasts have largely been about Cavaliers with a specifically Newark or Nottinghamshire focus. We're going to do something slightly different today. We're going to talk exclusively about a Roundhead, albeit a rubbish Roundhead that's easy to mock if you're a Cavalier. Major General Thomas Ballard. If you've been listening to these podcasts, his name crops up periodically as the Roundhead officer who completely ruined Parliament's attempts to take Newark in the very first siege. And if you're listening to this podcast for the first time, there were 3 sieges of Newark throughout the Civil War. I'm not going to explain what they're about. If you want to know, press pause, go back, listen to episode 1, and then come back here and pick up where you left off. But before Major General Ballard ruined his reputation in his failure to take Newark in the first siege, his reputation was quite formidable. John Twentyman, an observer of the 3 sieges from inside the wars of Newark and subject of episode 5 of this podcast, acknowledged Major General Thomas Ballard's prowess when he admitted that from a parliamentarian point of view, the Major General was expected to do wonders against the Cavaliers when he marched against Newark. Lucy Hutchinson, the wife of the Governor of Nottingham, made reference to Thomas Ballard's military reputation by referring to him as having been bred up in the wars abroad. So when Major General Thomas Ballard marched against Newark in the early months of 1643, the people of Newark must have been, to use the parlance of the time, cacking their pants. Such was his reputation for ferocity in battle. Yet within a day and a half, he's slinking back across the East Midlands with his tail between his legs and his reputation permanently in tatters. So what went wrong? Well, let's go back to the beginning, shall we? Or at least let's go back to the beginning of his military career. Thomas Ballard was a veteran of the 30 Years' War, the phenomenally bloody and brutal religious conflict that had started out as a fight between Catholics and Protestants and then snowballed into something a little bit more dynastic, far more complicated than even I can properly understand or explain. Many British soldiers went over there to earn their pay as mercenaries, and Thomas Ballard was one of them. He accompanied the great Scottish soldier James Hamilton when Hamilton crossed the sea to fight for Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. We don't really know much about what Thomas Ballard accomplished, but he did earn a compliment from Edward Hyde, the first Earl of Clarendon, who said of him that he was a soldier of good reputation and great trust. Around about 1638, Ballard came back to England and served under Lord Grandison for a short period of time, where he was promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. And then he served under Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex. And then, in 1642, the Civil War began. Now, Thomas Ballard was conflicted over which side to fight for. He had many friends who decided to support the king, but Ballard decided to fight for Parliament against the king. He decided to stick with his benefactor, Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex, who'd been given command of the Parliamentarian army. Ballard was supposed to accompany Essex to put down a rebellion in Ireland, but Essex ordered him to stay where he was. Ballard's first taste of action in the Civil War was at the first big battle of the conflict, the Battle of Edge Hill in Warwickshire. Ballard was put in command of the reserve infantry. At one crucial point in the battle, the Roundhead centre line of infantry was starting to collapse. Ballard was sent on to the battlefield to plug the gap in the ragged centre of the Roundhead line and took on Royalist infantry pike against pike. Pikes effectively being 18-foot-long spears that took an enormous amount of upper body strength and skill to wield. Ballard held the line and sent the Cavaliers packing. Ballard exhibited good leadership and great personal courage. Thomas Ballard's contribution to the Battle of Edge Hill delivered Parliament a conclusive, unequivocal Pyrrhic draw. Inconclusive though the battle might have been, Thomas Ballard did very well off the back of it. In January 1643, he was promoted to Major General and was put in charge of all the Roundhead forces in Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, and Nottinghamshire. But there were rumblings within the parliamentarian ranks concerning Major General Thomas Ballard, and questions were being asked. Firstly, people suspected his loyalty because, as I've already mentioned, he had a lot of friends on the other side. In fact, in September 1642, just before the Battle of Edge Hill, he was actually suspected of being disloyal to Parliament. The accusations came to nothing, and I'm imagining that his conduct at Edge Hill did a lot to dispel those rumours. And then there were questions about his character. One of his own sergeants, a man named Nehemiah Wharton, accused Thomas Ballard of being a profane wretch. What does that mean? It means that Thomas Ballard liked to drink a bit, or a lot, and swore a bit, or quite a bit actually, and liked to fight. But wasn't he a Roundhead, I hear you say, and weren't Roundheads strict and religious and didn't like drinking? No, not really, not at the beginning of the war anyway. Much of the popular notion of what constitutes a Roundhead comes from how the Parliamentarian army was at the end of the war, once the Puritans had largely taken control of it. But at the beginning of the war, the Parliamentarian army was a broad church, shall we say, made up of a mixture of strict Puritans and people like Major General Thomas Ballard, who liked to drink and liked to fight and didn't particularly like Puritans. Both factions uneasily unified in their common belief that the king had too much power. And like all good factions, when they weren't unified in fighting a common enemy, they would turn on each other. Both sets of accusations against Thomas Ballard came to nothing, by the way. He had proved himself where it counted on the field of battle, and besides, he had the goodwill of Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex and Commander-in-Chief of the Parliamentarian forces. In 1643, he was given his first and last campaign to take Cavalier Newark. And Newark was there for the taking. And despite Newark's importance strategically, and if you want to know why, just go and listen to episode 1. Its siege defences were pretty feeble. It had 1,000 soldiers to defend it, but Ballard was marching against it with 6,000 soldiers and a number of pieces of artillery. But he had to take Newark quickly before it was reinforced with more Royalist soldiers. The first siege of Newark, Major General Ballard's siege of Newark, began on the 27th of February 1643. Ballard approached Newark with soldiers from Lincoln, and he had arranged to rendezvous with soldiers from Nottingham and Derby a mile outside of Newark. Ballard was approaching Newark at a leisurely pace. A Lincolnshire gentleman under Ballard's command felt that he wasn't moving his soldiers quickly enough and told Ballard to hurry up. Ballard ignored this insubordinate, carried on going at a pace that seemed comfortable to him. Now, at this point, I think it's important to say that Major General Ballard probably did have Cavalier friends in Newark. And in the aftermath of Ballard's catastrophic attempt to take Newark, his dawdling would be interpreted by his Puritan enemies as deliberately dragging his heels and slowing down the whole entire attack so that the three forces wouldn't meet up on time, and that Ballard would avoid attacking his former drinking cronies on the other side in Newark, also allowing said cronies to figure out what they were doing and plan an ambush for Parliament's troops, which, to strengthen the case for the opposition against Ballard, the Cavaliers did actually try to do. But the ambush never actually took place. Why? A fierce and violent storm erupted, that's why. And the storm forced Ballard, against his will if you believe the Puritans, to speed up his advance and outpace the storm. and presumably rendezvous with his soldiers quicker than he had intended. The second mistake that Major General Thomas Ballard made was the positioning of his cannons. He placed his cannons too far away from Newark to actually hit anything. The best you can say about this decision is that it was massively incompetent. The worst you can say about it is that it was an act of deliberate self-sabotage. Treachery, even. I mean, he wouldn't want to blow up one of his favourite pubs by mistake now, would he? Ballard delayed the order to attack Newark. His lack of decisiveness in ordering his troops to fight caused frustration among his officers, particularly a Puritan colonel from Nottingham called John Hutchinson, the husband of Lucy Hutchinson, who was quoted earlier in this episode. So Hutchinson comes up and starts pestering Ballard for orders. Ballard tells him to stand at the side of the town and fall on all as you see fit. In other words, do what seems best to you. And that's what Hutchinson does. He attacks some siege defences and drives the Cavaliers from them. In another part of Newark, a Captain King, one of Ballard's Lincolnshire officers, takes it upon himself to do a bit of street fighting. He captures a street and places a small cannon called a Drake in a house and points it at Newark. Progress? Well, you'd think so. But the problem with Captain King's initiative is that it was initiative. Ballard hadn't ordered him to do it. So Ballard commanded Captain King to stop what he was doing and retreat to a safer distance outside of Newark. Then it was reported to Ballard that some of the residents of Newark had started to flee the town. And some of his more feistier officers, including Colonel John Hutchinson, thought that Newark was on the verge of surrendering at that point, and they wanted Ballard to send in the cavalry and take the town. Ballard refused and ordered the cavalry to stay where they were, possibly because he feared that the reports of the defenders of Newark leaving the town was a ruse, and that he feared an ambush as a consequence. What happened next caught all of the Parliamentarians off guard. The defenders of Newark launched a surprise attack. They left the town and assaulted trenches manned by soldiers from Nottingham and Derby. A Roundhead soldier from Lincolnshire started running around shouting, "Fly for your lives!" Then 200 of his Parliamentarian Lincolnshire compatriots cut and run. And then the Derby men dropped their weapons and fled their trenches, allowing the Newark defenders to capture 3 of Ballard's colours and kill and take prisoner 200 of his men. Hutchinson and his Nottingham soldiers held their ground and stayed in their trenches and fought off the attacking Cavaliers, at least until they ran out of gunpowder. Just prior to running out of gunpowder, Colonel Hutchinson had sent a request for resupply to Ballard. The request went unanswered. Ballard would later claim that he never received such a request. Colonel Hutchinson had had the sense to leave a cannon loaded in case something like this happened. And as he evacuated his men from the now indefensible trench, he covered a retreat with a final blast of cannon fire, allowing Hutchinson to get all of his men to safety without losing a single soldier. Well, that was the end of the first day's fighting. I think it's fair to say that it had not gone particularly well for the Parliamentarian besieging force. But it was just one day's fighting. As the sun rose on the second day of the siege, some of Ballard's officers were keen to have another crack at Newark, learn from their mistakes, and take the town. But Ballard said no, and the Roundheads packed up and went back home. The first siege of Newark had lasted barely 2 days. And bizarrely, precisely at the point when Ballard should have been licking his wounds and covering his head in shame, he rewarded some of his soldiers with a gift of a couple of cannons for their conduct at Newark. Tellingly, Colonel John Hutchinson, arguably the most Puritan of all of his soldiers, and possibly the one that had served him the best, was not rewarded. And it would be Hutchinson's wife, Lucy, who would conduct a campaign against Ballard that would be instrumental in hastening the destruction of Major General Ballard's reputation. Ballard hadn't helped himself. He'd given his enemies all the ammunition they needed to destroy him. And Lucy Hutchinson didn't take any prisoners. Wherever she could, she let anyone that would listen who had influence know that she considered Ballard a coward and a traitor who deliberately sabotaged his own attack because he had friends in Newark. She interpreted the gifts of cannons to his officers as bribes in order to ensure their silence in the wake of his defeat. Her accusations had traction because the Nottingham Committee, the municipal government of Nottingham at the time, sent a complaint against Ballard to the House of Commons. The Nottingham Committee sent two men to London, a clergyman and a soldier called Captain Lummox, to persuade Parliament to relieve Major General Thomas Ballard of his command. The House of Commons took the charges seriously and were to put Ballard on trial. The official charges drafted against him were deceiving the trust put in him by Parliament. And how do you think the trial turned out? Major General Thomas Ballard was acquitted of all charges. Surprised? Well, you shouldn't be when you hear who was presiding over the trial. Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex, the chief military commander of the Parliamentarian army, and Major General Thomas Ballard's old benefactor. So basically, the Parliamentarian army was a bit of an old boys' network, a little bit how like one might imagine the Cavalier army was. Yes, it was, at least in the early years of the Civil War, before the Puritans got their hands on it and reformed it and turned it into the more disciplined, fanatical, morally upright and incorruptible fighting force we more readily associate with the Roundhead army. But don't think that Major General Thomas Ballard completely got away with it. Although the Earl of Essex seemed reluctant to subject Ballard to public disgrace, he wasn't above a little behind-the-scenes damage control. After the trial, Ballard was taken aside by Essex and advised that it would be best to leave the country for a while, just until all this nasty business had blown over. Ballard was obliged to go to Holland and wait to be called back into service. He never was. And even if Robert Devereux, the 3rd Earl of Essex, had wanted him back, after 1645 it was a moot point, because those Puritans that Ballard hated so much took control of the army, and Oliver Cromwell and Sir Thomas Fairfax were in charge, and had absolutely no use for soldiers like Major General Thomas Ballard, and the cronyism of generals like the Earl of Essex that had infected the Parliamentarian army up to that point. We don't really know what happened to Ballard after his exile, but rumours would surface about him once in a while, probably apocryphal, that he had come back to England and changed sides and fought for the Royalists, and that he'd been killed at the Battle of Taunton. I guess we'll never really know. And the question remains, after such a good start, why did Ballard fail so horribly at Newark? Was he a coward? Was he a traitor? Or was he just massively incompetent, promoted above his natural level of ability because he was mates with the Earl of Essex? I'll let you decide. What was not in doubt was that in failing to take Newark in such a demonstrably cack-handed fashion, he had gifted his enemies a perfect propaganda opportunity. And how were the Roundheads, who were masters of propaganda, going to spin this defeat into something positive? There is a pamphlet called Strange Accident at Newark that has a fantastic postscript, and I'll end this podcast with this. The Parliamentarians hold their hands up to defeat. They acknowledge that in war you win some, you lose some. They draw attention to a minor parliamentarian victory that was happening around about the same time. And then they say this: "The Lord is pleased to let us lose sometimes, for no soldier can expect a continual conquering in military action. Yet the Lord appears in abundance of good to us. We have of late many victories, and however the enemy may rejoice at this, yet let them know that the time will come wherein those misled souls they have traduced will curse those papists, prelates, priests,
friars and the rest that have misled them, and therefore we must wait God's time, whose deliverance is most glorious in his own time. Papists, prelates, priests, friars, and the rest. Classic Puritan. If in doubt, blame the Catholics. Works every time.
Thank you for listening to 17th Century Tales, written and recorded by Adam Nightingale in a secret Nottingham Roundhead location. Actually, I think we're going to stick with Roundheads for next week's episode and tell the story of the East Midlands premier Puritan power couple, John and Lucy Hutchinson. We met them briefly already in this episode. Their full story is really rather interesting, even though they be Roundheads. Previous episodes of this podcast, as well as other amazing resources for adults and children alike to occupy your minds, souls, brains, fingers, spirits in this interesting and bizarre time, can be found on the National Civil War Centre website. Follow the links to Learning from Home, or you can just press the link below. As always, the wonderful music for today's episode was provided by my brother, Mark Nightingale, as well as writing one of the wittier lines in today's episode. I'm not going to tell you which one. As always, stay safe and see you next time.